The chamber had no windows. It didn't need them. The Galactic Council had been meeting in the same place for over 4,000 years, and in 4,000 years not one member had ever asked to see outside. The ceiling was high and dark. The walls curved inward like the inside of a shell. Around the central floor, in rings that rose like a theater, sat the representatives of 49 species. Each one had traveled weeks or months to be here. Each one believed, with full sincerity, that this chamber was the most important place in the known galaxy. They were probably right. The air inside smelled like nothing. The environmental system was calibrated to offend no one, which meant it satisfied no one either. It was the smell of compromise, of process, of things decided by committee. At the center of the floor stood a tall figure in gray robes. His name was Veth. He was a Kure, long-limbed, pale-skinned, with wide dark eyes that had seen the inside of this chamber more times than he could count. He had been a senior council member for 31 years. He had stood at that center floor and presented cases for planetary annexation, species relocation, trade route disputes, and extinction orders. Extinction orders were the least interesting part of the job. He tapped the control surface in front of him and brought up the display. A blue planet rotated slowly above the floor, small, unremarkable. Mostly water with brown and green landmasses clustered in the middle latitudes, one large moon, a thin atmosphere, a single star that was neither old nor young. Earth, Veth said, his voice carried easily. The translation systems embedded in every seat converted his words into 48 other languages without a sound. Every representative heard him in their own tongue, with their own idioms, as if he were speaking directly to them. Third planet of a minor system in the Orion Arm. Species designation, human. Biological classification, carbon-based, mammalian, bipedal. Population current estimate, 9.4 billion. He paused. Technological progression rate, high, anomalously high. A few heads shifted in the upper rings. Not many. Most were looking at their own data screens or talking quietly to their aides. Veth was used to this. Extinction orders rarely drew much attention. They were maintenance work. The galaxy was old and large, and young species had a way of growing in directions that created problems if left unchecked. The Council had developed a clean and efficient process for handling it. A fleet was dispatched. A planet was pacified. The species was either relocated to a managed reserve or eliminated entirely, depending on their level of development and the value of their homeworld's resources. Earth's resources were average, its location was inconvenient, and its species had, according to 3 separate projection models, a 17% chance of becoming a Class 4 territorial threat within the next 2 centuries. 17% was not high, but the cost of a pacification fleet now was considerably lower than the cost of a war later. The math was simple. The Council had done it many times. Current threat assessment, Veth continued, places the human species at Class 2, progressing toward Class 3. They have achieved limited space travel, permanent settlements on their moon and on the 4th planet of their system, several deep space probes, no faster than light capability, no confirmed knowledge of galactic civilization. He looked up at the rings. They do not know we are coming. He said it without any particular tone. It was a standard line, standard information. Most primitives didn't know the Council existed until the fleet arrived, and by then it was too late for the information to be useful. The recommendation is pacification with full planetary clearance, Veth said. Dispatch of a standard Class 1 fleet, 200 vessels. Estimated completion, 72 hours from first contact. He stepped back from the floor. The session moderator, a heavy-set Drell with 4 arms and an expression of permanent exhaustion, opened the floor to discussion. He looked like he was hoping there wouldn't be any. There was almost none. A representative from the Tharnic Collective asked whether the human homeworld had any mineral deposits worth preserving. Veth confirmed it did not. The representative sat back down. A Serenthi elder asked whether any protected observation status had been previously granted. Veth confirmed it had not. The elder made a small sound of acknowledgement and returned to their data screen. Then a voice came from the lower ring. "I'd like to speak." Veth looked up. The voice belonged to a young Kurai seated 3 positions to the left of the main Kurai delegation block. She was junior by every measure, young, low-ranked, and not scheduled to address the floor today. Her name was Saris. Veth knew her vaguely. She had been assigned to the Outer Systems Monitoring Division 6 months ago. She was considered thorough. She was also considered, by several of her seniors, to be overly cautious. The moderator nodded at her, briefly. Saris stood. She was holding a data tablet, and her grip on it was tighter than it needed to be. "I've been reviewing the human files for the past 4 months, she said. Full files. Military records, conflict history, weapons development trajectories, psychological studies. She looked at Veth. "I want to register a concern before this vote. Veth kept his expression neutral. The floor is yours. The 17% projection is based on standard models, Sarah said. Those models assume that a species with no knowledge of galactic civilization will follow one of three development curves: expansion, consolidation, or stagnation. She set the tablet on the rail in front of her. The human species doesn't follow any of those curves. Their development isn't linear. It isn't even consistent. They have been at war with themselves for the entirety of their recorded history. They have destroyed entire civilizations, rebuilt them, destroyed them again. They have fought wars over land, resources, ideology, religion, and things that have no material value at all. She paused. And every time they fight, they build better weapons. The chamber was quiet, not the silence of interest, the silence of mild impatience. Their current military hardware, Saris continued, is significantly more advanced than our Class 1 fleet projections account for. We are using data that is 4 years old. The human species does not stay still for 4 years. Veth spoke from his position near the center. Junior Saris. The projection models include a developmental variance buffer of, the buffer is 18 months, she said. I know. I read it. She looked at the rings. I'm telling this chamber that a species which has been at war continuously for 6,000 years, which has developed nuclear, chemical, biological, and kinetic weapons against themselves, not against us, and which has been quietly industrializing its outer solar system for the past 4 decades, may not respond to a pacification fleet the way a standard Class 2 species responds. A small ripple of noise moved through the upper rings. Not concern, something closer to amusement. The Tharnic representative leaned toward his aide and said something in a low voice. The moderator looked at Saris with the polite blankness of someone who had already decided how this would end. Thank you, Junior Saris. The concerns are noted. I'm requesting a full updated survey before any fleet is dispatched. The request is noted. I'm requesting a delay of Junior Saris. The moderator's voice was still polite, still flat. The request is noted. Are there any further technical objections from the floor? There were not. The vote proceeded. 47 in favor, 3 opposed. The 3 opposing votes came from smaller species whose own histories included pacification orders. They voted against every extinction resolution, every time as a matter of principle. It never changed anything. Sarah sat down. She put the tablet in her lap and looked at the blue planet still rotating above the center floor. Small, unremarkable, mostly water. She had read every file, every conflict record, every weapons test log that their monitoring arrays had captured. She had read about a war that ended with 2 cities burned to ash in a single morning. She had read about the weapons developed after that, each one larger and more total in its destruction than the last. She had read about the submarines that could stay underwater for months, invisible and armed, the missile systems, the orbital kinetic platforms, the coordinated fighter networks. All of it built for use against other humans. She thought about that. She had thought about it every day for 4 months. A species that built those things to use on itself. What would it do with them when it turned outward? The display above the floor winked out. Earth was gone. The session moderator moved to the next item on the agenda, which was a trade dispute between 2 mid-tier species over shipping lane rights in the Cassian corridor. Several representatives immediately looked more interested. Veth walked past Saris's position on his way back to the main delegation block. He paused for just a moment. Your concern was thorough, he said, but the models are reliable. We've done this before. 12 times, she said. 12 times, he agreed. And not one of them caused our fleet significant difficulty. He gave her a small, not unkind look. These are primitives. Saris. They have no idea we exist. He moved on. Saris stayed in her seat long after the session ended. The chamber emptied around her. The lights dimmed to their between-session level. The air continued to smell like nothing. She opened her tablet and found the image she kept returning to. Not a weapons diagram, not a fleet projection. It was a photograph, taken by one of their distant observation probes, of a human shipyard on the 4th planet of the Sol system, the one they called Mars. The shipyard was large, larger than their 4-year-old surveys had recorded, significantly larger. The structures were industrial and dense, built without elegance, built for output, and in the dry dock cradles that lined the facility's main axis, she had counted many times, the shapes of vessels under construction. They were not small. They were not scientific survey ships or cargo haulers. They were built with thick hulls, with weapons emplacements, with engine clusters that suggested a drive capacity well beyond anything a Class 2 species should be producing. She looked at them for a long time. Then she did something that was technically outside her clearance level. She opened a private communications channel, encrypted, routed through 3 relay points, and she began composing a message, not to the council, not to her superiors. The message was addressed to a set of coordinates she had pulled from the monitoring files. Earth's deep space communication array, the one they used to send signals outward, searching for something they didn't know, was already watching. She wrote the message in simple mathematical notation, the closest thing to a universal language that existed across species. It was short. It took her less than 3 minutes to write. It said in the clearest terms she could manage, "A fleet is coming. You have 6 days. We voted. I am sorry." She sent it. She sat back in her seat in the empty chamber and looked at the ceiling, which was dark and curved inward like the inside of a shell. On the other side of the galaxy, the pacification fleet was already forming up. 200 vessels of various classes, crewed by experienced officers who had done this many times before. Their commander was a Veth-class senior officer named Drac. He was competent, professional, and deeply uninterested in the assignment. He had pacified 4 worlds in his career. It was not complicated work. He read the briefing file on his way to the bridge. Earth, 9.4 billion primitives. No faster-than-light capability. No knowledge of galactic civilization. He set the file down before he finished it. Set course, he told his navigator. The fleet moved. 200 ships, in clean formation, cutting through dark space toward a small blue planet that didn't know they were coming. In her chair in the empty chamber, Saris closed her tablet. She hoped someone on the other end was listening. She didn't think it would matter. She hoped she was wrong. The signal arrived on a Tuesday. Nobody was expecting it. Nobody was watching for it. The deep space array on the far side of the moon was running its usual automated sweep. Same sweep it ran every 6 hours every day every year, cataloging background radiation, mapping signal noise, logging the endless static of space. The technician on duty was a young man named Prakash, who was on his 3rd cup of coffee and halfway through a crossword puzzle when the array's alert system made a sound it had never made before. He looked up from the puzzle. The sound came again. He set the coffee down. The signal was short, mathematically structured, not random noise, not solar interference, not anything in the library of known natural phenomena. It was a deliberate transmission, encoded in base notation so clean and precise that the array's translation software had partially decoded it within 4 minutes of receipt. Prakash read the decoded text 3 times. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor. His supervisor called her supervisor. That call went up 6 levels in 40 minutes, which was actually quite fast for a government communication chain, and within 2 hours the decoded message was sitting on a screen in front of the UN Secretary General and 14 other people in a room in Geneva that had no windows and very uncomfortable chairs. The message said, "A fleet is coming. You have 6 days. I am sorry." The room was quiet for a long moment. Voted on what? Someone said. Nobody answered that. The Secretary General was a tall woman named Adeze Nwosu, who had spent 30 years in international diplomacy and believed, firmly and with evidence, that most crises were manageable if you kept your head and moved fast. She looked at the message for a long time. Then she looked at the people around the table. "Get me General Osi," she said. "Get me every space agency director on the planet, and find out if any of our deep space arrays have picked up anything anomalous in the last 72 hours. They had. They had, in fact, picked up several things, drive signatures, the array analysts were calling them. Clusters of energy output consistent with large vessels moving at high velocity on an approach vector that pointed, with uncomfortable precision, directly at the inner solar system. The analysts had flagged the readings as instrument error. 3 separate analysts, 3 separate arrays, all flagging the same anomaly as error, because the alternative was something none of them had been trained to consider. By the time General Mara Osi arrived in Geneva, they had confirmed it was not instrument error. The fleet was real. It was large. And it was 6 days out. Osi was 54 years old. She was short and broad-shouldered, with close-cut gray hair, and the kind of face that did not waste expressions on things that didn't matter. She had commanded ground forces in 2 conflicts, then moved into the Joint Defense Command 15 years ago when it became clear to the people, watching her, that she thought about war differently than most people did. Not emotionally, not politically. She thought about it the way an engineer thinks about a structure. What are the load-bearing points? Where does it fail? What do you build it from if you need it to stand? She sat down at the table in Geneva and read the full briefing in silence. Drive signatures. Fleet size estimate. Between 180 and 220 vessels. Approach vector confirmed. 6 days. She read the decoded message again. "A fleet is coming. You have 6 days. We voted. I am sorry." She looked up. "What do we know about the ships?" The analysis team had prepared a projection. The signatures were consistent with large vessels, larger than anything Earth had built. Most of them, though the energy output varied widely across the formation. Some were very large, some were mid-sized. The formation held tight and consistent, which suggested experienced crews operating under coordinated command. "Do we have any indication of weapons capability?" OC asked. "We don't know," the analyst said. "We've never seen anything like this before." "Best guess," the analyst hesitated. "A fleet this size, traveling in a pacification formation." That was the technical term the analyst used, pacification formation, which told OC immediately that someone in the room had already spent the last 2 hours doing research they hadn't shared yet. Would carry enough firepower to cause serious damage to planetary infrastructure. "Meaning," OC said, "they can glass us from orbit if they choose to." The analyst looked at the table. "Potentially, yes." The room broke into noise. Several voices at once. "Negotiate. Respond to the signal. Send a message. Find whoever sent the warning. Reach out. Talk." There had to be a way to talk. OC let them talk for 90 seconds. Then she said, with no particular volume, "We fight back." The room went quiet. The Secretary General looked at her. "General, they sent a pacification fleet," OC said. "Not a contact team. Not a diplomatic vessel. A fleet. Whatever we say to them in the next 6 days, they are not coming to talk." She looked around the table. "We can send messages. We should send messages. But while we're sending messages, we need to be doing something else." She pulled up a map of the solar system on the room's main screen. "Mars, the asteroid belt, Luna. We have assets," she said. The room did not understand what she meant. She explained. The shipyards had been there for a long time. The Luna facility was the oldest. Started 40 years ago by a joint program that had originally been classified as a heavy transport infrastructure project. That was true, technically. The first ships built there were heavy haulers, designed to move ore from the asteroid belt to Earth's orbital stations. Large, slow, heavily armored to survive debris impacts. Then the engineers looked at what they had built and made a decision that was never formally approved by any committee, but was never formally stopped, either. They started building the haulers thicker, larger, with engine clusters that had no reason to be that powerful on a mining vessel, with internal configurations that could be, with certain modifications, converted to other purposes. The asteroid belt facility started in year 12 of the Luna program, built to be invisible, embedded in a rock cluster, running cold, designed to look exactly like an automated mining operation. Mars had 3 facilities, all of them active. Nobody had ever explained, in any official document, why Earth's space infrastructure program had quietly produced vessels that looked, under detailed analysis, less like cargo ships and more like warships. The people who built them knew. The people who funded them knew. It was the kind of thing that existed in the space between official policy and practical necessity, maintained by people who had looked at Earth's history and drawn conclusions that nobody in a committee room wanted to say out loud. Humanity had been at war with itself for thousands of years. The people who built the ships understood what that meant. They had taken everything those wars produced, every lesson, every innovation, every brutal efficiency, and they had put it into hulls. Not for aliens. They didn't know about aliens, for each other. General Osi had known about the shipyards for 11 years. She had visited each facility twice. She had reviewed every vessel, every specification, every capability report. She had never once believed they would be used for what they were now being asked to do. She believed it now. She gave the order at 3 in the morning Geneva time, and by 4 the shipyards were running at full capacity. Every vessel that was complete or near complete was being prepared for launch. Every crew that had been trained, and they had been trained quietly, for years in programs that officially did not exist, was being recalled. The first ship to power its drives was the Unus Adamant. It was not a beautiful ship. Nobody who saw it would have called it beautiful. It was massive and dense, built with the kind of practicality that ignores aesthetics entirely. Its hull was thick, several times thicker than it needed to be for the pressures of space travel, because the engineers who designed it had been thinking about something other than space travel when they set the hull. Tolerances. Its weapon systems were numerous and redundant. If you destroyed one, 3 more covered the same arc. Its engine cluster was oversized for its frame, which made it fast in ways that its bulk suggested it shouldn't be. It looked, to the people on Mars who watched it power up, like something that had been built for the specific purpose of refusing to die. The captain of the Adamant was a woman named Torres. She had served 20 years in the program, had been waiting for this moment, without knowing exactly what moment she was waiting for. And when the launch order came through, she read it twice, and then told her crew to strap in. Back in Geneva, OC stood in front of a screen that showed the shipyard activation status. Green lights coming on, one after another, across 3 facilities. The Secretary General stood beside her. "How many ships?" 47 ready for immediate launch, OC said. 14 more within 48 hours, against 200. "Yes, General." Those are terrible odds. OC looked at the screen. The green lights kept coming. They are, she said. But they built their fleet to pacify a Class 2 species. She turned to look at the Secretary General. They have the wrong information. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. The Secretary General was a smart woman. She would work it out. On the third day, Saris received a response to her message. She was in her quarters on the Council observation vessel. She had requested a posting on the monitoring ship that would follow the fleet at safe distance, which her superiors had granted without asking why. When her private terminal chimed, the response was short, also in mathematical notation, also clean and precise. It said, "Thank you, we know." Saris read it several times. "We know," not "we surrender." Not "we will negotiate," not "please help us," not "what do we do, we know." She sat with that for a long time. Then she pulled up the shipyard image again. The one from Mars, the dry dock cradles, the thick-hulled shapes she had been looking at for months. She counted them again. Then she opened the full sensor report that the fleet's long-range arrays had just filed. The first detailed scan of the inner solar system, now that they were close enough for resolution. She read the number of active drive signatures coming from Earth's facilities. She set the report down. She thought about the message, "We know." She thought about what a species did when it knew. Not a species that had lived in peace for centuries. Not a species that had built its technology in careful, supervised progression under the guidance of older civilizations. A species that had been doing nothing but fighting for thousands of years. That had turned every conflict into a lesson. That had never, in its entire recorded history, responded to an existential threat by surrendering. Saris opened a new message channel, not to Earth this time, to the Council. She began typing. She wrote, "I need you to look at the updated sensor reports. I need you to look at what is launching from the human facilities right now. I need you to understand that the fleet we sent is not sufficient." She sent it. She already knew they wouldn't listen. They hadn't listened the first time. Outside her window, the stars were cold and still, and somewhere ahead in the dark, 200 ships moved toward a small blue planet. And on that planet and its neighbors, engines were firing up, one after another. Green lights on a screen in Geneva. A woman standing in front of them who had spent her life learning the geometry of violence. The Adamant was already moving. 46 more ships behind it, 14 more coming. Nobody on Earth slept much in those 6 days. But Ose noticed something. Moving through the facilities and the command centers and the briefing rooms. People were afraid. Of course they were afraid. But underneath the fear there was something else. Something older and harder and very familiar to anyone who had studied what humans did when they were cornered. They got focused. They got very, very focused. On day 6, the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the solar system. Their long-range sensors swept the space ahead. Fleet Commander Drac read the initial scan report. He read it twice. He called his senior officer to the bridge. "Confirm these readings," he said. The senior officer confirmed them. Drac looked at the scan for a long time. 47 human vessels in tight formation, sitting still, waiting. He had been told there would be a handful of primitive defense stations. He looked at the formation on his screen, at the hull signatures, at the weapons emplacements his sensors were now resolving. "Interesting," he said, in a tone that suggested he didn't find it interesting at all, but rather something for which he didn't have an immediate word. He gave the order to advance. He was a professional. He had done this before. The numbers still favored him 4-1. And his ships were built by a civilization that had been traveling the stars for 4,000 years. He advanced. The human ships did not move. They held formation and waited. Drac had pacified 4 worlds. In all 4 cases when his fleet appeared, the response had been the same. Confusion, panic, scattered resistance, collapse. He watched the human formation on his screen. They were not panicking. They were waiting. He advanced anyway. The space between the 2 fleets was 40,000 kilometers. It was nothing. In the scale of the solar system, in the scale of the galaxy, 40,000 kilometers was the distance between 2 people standing in the same room. But for 6 minutes, nothing moved. The 2 formations sat across that gap like they were waiting for something. Permission, maybe, or the right moment, or just the particular silence that comes before very loud things happen. Drax stood at the main display on his bridge and studied the human formation. 47 ships. He had confirmed the count 3 times. They were arranged in a pattern that his tactical system flagged as non-standard. Not because it was sophisticated, but because it didn't match any formation in the database. His system contained the recorded tactical patterns of 61 species. 61 species across 4,000 years of conflict and pacification. The human formation matched none of them. It was dense. The ships were close together. Closer than most species kept their vessels in a combat formation. which was usually spread for defensive coverage. The humans were bunched. The tactical computer suggested this might indicate poor training, inexperienced crews defaulting to proximity for psychological comfort. Drack's senior officer, a lean Karai named Voss, stood beside him. "They're not moving," Voss said. "I see that." Standard response would be to scatter, or attempt communication. They're doing neither. Voss looked at the display. Could be a sensor ghost. Automated vessels, no crew. Drack had considered this, he had discarded it. The drive signatures were wrong for automated ships. Automated vessels ran at consistent output. These were variable, each ship's drives running at slightly different levels, the kind of variation you got from 47 different hands on 47 different throttles. There were people in those ships, people who were sitting still and waiting. "Suppression wave," Drack said. "Full spread, let's end this cleanly." The suppression wave was the standard opening move in a pacification engagement. It was an electromagnetic pulse system, scaled to fleet deployment, designed to do three things simultaneously. First, it disrupted electronic systems, weapons targeting, communications, navigation. Second, it created a low-frequency resonance effect in enclosed metal spaces that most biological species found deeply disorienting, something between nausea and panic at a level below conscious thought. Third, it was visible, a wall of blue-white light that rolled outward from the fleet line, and the sight of it, in every recorded engagement, had caused formations to break. Seeing something like that come at you and hold your position required either extraordinary discipline or the complete failure to understand what you were looking at. Drack had never had a target hold position through a suppression wave. He fired it. The wave rolled outward across the 40,000 kilometers, beautiful in its way, a curving sheet of light, even in total, moving at the speed of the fleet's projector range. It hit the human formation in the span of a breath. For 3 seconds, Drack saw nothing change. Then 7 of the human ships went dark. Drive signatures dropped. No movement. Just dark hulls sitting in the formation's shape like gaps in teeth. He had expected more. He watched the remaining 40 vessels, waiting for the scatter. It didn't come. One of them fired. A single vessel, mid-formation, not the lead ship, opened up with what Drack's system identified as a kinetic battery and a directed energy array. Working in tandem, the kinetic rounds were large, very large, larger than standard for a ship that size. The directed energy output was also high, higher than the hull classification suggested should be possible, which meant either the sensor reading was wrong, or the humans had put a weapon system into a frame that his database said couldn't support it. The round struck one of his midline destroyers. The destroyer's shields absorbed part of it. The rest got through. The destroyer lost a section of its port side and dropped out of formation. Then the rest of the human ships fired, not all at once, in sequence, rolling from one end of their formation to the other, like something that had been planned and rehearsed. Each ship picking a target, each ship firing a different combination of weapons, kinetic, energy, something Drack's system couldn't classify that hit one of his cruisers and caused a containment failure in its secondary drive. The cruiser detonated. Drack's bridge was suddenly loud. "Return fire," he said. "All ships, return fire. Concentrate on the lead vessel." His fleet responded 200 ships against 40. The math was clear. The weight of fire that came back at the human formation was enormous. Energy weapons, torpedoes, more suppression bursts targeted at individual vessels. It was the kind of fire that, in every previous engagement Drack had conducted, ended things within minutes. The lead human ship, the large, ugly, dense-hulled one his system had flagged at the front of the formation, took 3 direct hits. It kept moving. It took a 4th hit, a torpedo strike that peeled a section of its upper hull back and vented atmosphere from at least 2 compartments. It kept moving. It took a 5th hit. A 6th accelerated. Drack watched this. He watched a ship that should, by any structural calculation, have been dead or disabled after the 2nd hit, absorb 6 strikes and increase its speed. The hull damage was visible on his sensors. The ship was venting, burning in places. One of its weapons arrays was dark and gone, but its main batteries were still firing, and its engines were pushing it forward. And it was, according to his sensor readout, heading directly toward his fleet line. "What is it doing?" Voss said quietly. The answer became clear about 30 seconds later. The lead human ship was not trying to break through the fleet line. It was not making a run for open space. It was going straight at his flagship. "Evasive," Drack said. His flagship moved. It was a large vessel, one of the largest in the fleet, and it moved more slowly than he would have liked. The human ship adjusted course with it, still coming, still firing. One of its shots took out his flagship's forward sensor array. 2 more human ships pulled out of the formation and joined the lead vessel, forming a narrow arrowhead aimed at his flagship's center mass. Drack fired everything at them. He destroyed one. The second took hits that would have destroyed any ship in his fleet and slowed without stopping. The lead ship, the ugly, burning, thick-hulled thing, was now close enough that his short-range systems were picking up the detail of its damage, and what they showed made Voss go quiet beside him. The ship had taken 11 hits, sections of it were open to space. Its port weapons array was completely destroyed. Something internal was burning. The heat signature was wrong for a controlled system. It was structural. The ship was on fire inside and still accelerating. "It's going to ram us," Voss said. "Destroy it," Drax said. They fired everything at it. Concentrated. The firepower that hit that single ship in the next 15 seconds was enough to reduce a small moon debris. It slowed. The engines finally gave. It drifted, dark and broken, 300 kilometers from his flagship's bow. Drax breathed. Then the second ship, the one that had taken hits and slowed, hit his flagship's midsection at half speed. Not a ram. It didn't destroy his ship, but it tore a long gash in the port hull and destroyed his main weapons array and killed 41 members of his crew and knocked his flagship out of the engagement for the next 20 minutes, while damage control teams ran through the corridors, and the ship groaned in places it shouldn't have been groaning. In those 20 minutes, the human formation finished what it had started. Without Drax's flagship coordinating fire, 2 sections of his fleet line lost cohesion. Ships fired overlapping arcs, blocked each other's angles, crossed their own torpedoes' paths. The humans hit those gaps like they had been watching for them. Probably because they had been watching for them. Sitting still in that tight, dense formation, reading his fleet's patterns for 6 minutes before they fired a single shot. They went through the gaps like water through cracks. His ships were well built, well armed, crewed by experienced officers who had fought in real conflicts. But they had been built for a certain kind of engagement, the kind where the other side had less technology, less firepower, less everything, the kind where superior capability produced predictable results. This was not that kind. The humans were not fighting to survive. They were fighting to damage. Every maneuver was aimed at getting close, getting inside his fleet's optimal engagement range, where his longer weapons couldn't depress to track, and his shorter weapons had to deal with targets that were turning, burning, and for some reason not going away when they should have gone away. He lost 9 more ships before he reformed his fleet line. In 4 hours of engagement, his 200-ship pacification fleet had lost 19 vessels. 3 more were damaged significantly enough to be combat ineffective. 31 humans' ships were still operational, and 12 of those were moving in ways that suggested they were damaged, but choosing to ignore it. His suppression wave had disabled 7 human ships. He had destroyed 8. The math was wrong. The math was deeply structurally wrong, and Drax had spent 4 hours trying to find the error in it, and the error was not in his math. The error was in the assumptions that went into the model that generated the math, and those assumptions had been built on 61 species worth of data. That did not include a species that had spent thousands of years developing weapons specifically for use against things with the same hull strength, the same damage tolerance, and the same pain threshold as themselves. His ships were built to fight primitives. The human ships had been built to fight humans. He pulled his fleet back to reform. His senior officer stood beside him and said nothing for a while. Then Voss said, "They're not following." Drax looked at the display. The human formation had not pursued. They had held their position, pulled their damaged ships back into the cluster, and stopped. "They're regrouping." Drax said, "So are we, yes." Voss looked at him. "Sir, we lost 19 ships, I know. To 47 vessels with no faster-than-light capability, no experience in fleet engagements, and technology we assessed as significantly below our own. I know, Voss, the assessment was wrong." Drax looked at the human formation on his screen. The tight, ugly cluster of ships, several of them venting and burning, none of them running. Just sitting there, waiting again. He thought about the late ship, the one that had taken 11 hits and kept coming. He thought about the burning inside it, the structural fire that meant internal damage beyond anything his engineers would have kept a ship moving through. He thought about whoever was flying it, deciding to accelerate into that fire instead of pulling back. He did not have a word for that. He sat down at his command station and began composing a message to the council. He wrote it carefully. He wrote the ship losses. He wrote the engagement summary. He wrote the corrected threat assessment. Then he wrote one additional line, at the end, which was not standard protocol but which he believed was necessary. He wrote, "Request immediate reinforcement. Recommend reclassification of human species. Standard pacification models do not apply. Fleet of 600 minimum advised before resuming engagement." He sent it. Outside, 31 human ships sat in tight formation and waited, and somewhere on the planet turning slowly in the distance, or on one of the facilities orbiting around it, 14 more ships were finishing their construction. Drac looked at his ship count. 178 effective vessels remaining. He waited for the council to respond. It took longer than it should have. When the response came, it did not say what he expected. It said, "Reinforcements dispatched. 600 vessels. Maintain position. Do not re-engage until arrival." Drac read it twice. 600 more ships. The council had sent 600 more ships. He had asked for a reclassification and a reassessment. Instead, they had sent more of the same, just larger numbers. He sat with that for a moment. Then he looked at the human formation again. Still there, still waiting. He thought about what Saris had said in the council chamber, the young junior diplomat who had read all the files and asked for a delay and been ignored. He had been in the chamber that day. He had been part of the delegation that had voted without listening to her. He was listening now. He didn't know what 600 more ships would accomplish against something that took 11 hits and kept accelerating. He didn't know, and that uncertainty was new, and it sat in his chest like something cold. He maintained position. He waited. The human ships waited too. The council chamber had never been loud like this. In 4,000 years of sessions, the chamber had seen arguments, disputes, even the occasional diplomatic incident that required the moderator to suspend proceedings. But it had always maintained a certain quality, a controlled temperature, a managed noise level, the sound of civilization processing problems through established procedure. That was gone. Veth stood in the middle of the floor and read Drac's report out loud, and by the time he reached the ship losses, the chamber had already stopped being a chamber and become something closer to a room full of frightened people who had agreed, just days ago, that this would be routine. 19 ships, in 4 hours, against 47 vessels with no faster-than-light capability and technology that had been assessed, by the best models the Council's analytical division possessed, as significantly inferior to their own. "This is not possible," the Tharnic representative said. He was the one who had asked about minerals. He looked like he regretted asking about minerals now. "The report is confirmed," Veth said. He kept his voice level. He had been keeping his voice level for the past hour since the message arrived, and it was costing him more effort than anything he had done in 31 years in this chamber. "Fleet Commander Drac's sensor logs are attached and verified. 19 vessels destroyed, 3 combat ineffective, 31 human vessels remaining operational." "Remaining," someone said. "They lost 16 ships and 31 are still fighting." "Correct. Out of 47, correct." The noise came back up, multiple species talking at once, the translation systems layering everything into a wall of sound. The moderator called for order twice and got partial compliance. From her seat in the lower ring, Saris watched Veth. He was holding himself very still. She knew that stillness. She had seen it on people who had been wrong in a way they couldn't yet process. The body went quiet while the mind tried to find somewhere to put the information that didn't fit. She had been living in that place for 4 months. She stood up. She didn't wait for the moderator to call on her. She stood up and she spoke, and her voice was steady and clear, and the translation systems carried it to every seat in the chamber. "I need to present the updated sensor data," she said. The moderator looked at her. Then he looked at the chamber, which was still loud and disorganized, and not benefiting from the absence of something to focus on. He nodded at her. She walked to the center floor. She had prepared this, not because she had known it would come to this. She had hoped, genuinely, that it wouldn't. But because preparation was the only thing she had been able to do with the dread that had been sitting in her chest since the vote. She pulled up the display, not Blue Planet this time, the solar system, their fleet's position, the human formation, and then the shipyard data. "This is the Mars facility as of our last survey 4 years ago," she said. The image appeared above the floor. Dry dock cradles, 14 vessels under construction. Hull signatures consistent with heavy industrial transport. She let the chamber look at it for a moment. "This is the same facility from our long-range scan taken 6 days ago." The image changed. The chamber went quiet. The dry dock cradles had more than doubled in number. The vessels in them were not the same shape as the ones from 4 years ago. They were larger. The hull profiles were heavier, denser, with the weapons emplacements clearly visible even at sensor resolution. No ambiguity, no interpretation required. No way to call them industrial transport ships. "At the time of our fleet's first contact with the human formation," Saris said, 14 additional vessels of this class were in final construction stages across 3 human facilities. They have since launched. She looked at the chamber. Earth's fleet is no longer 47 ships. She let that sit for a moment. It is 61. A Serenthi elder in the upper ring made a sound that needed no translation. "I would also like to present the conflict history review that I submitted to this chamber prior to the vote," Saris continued. which was noted and not acted upon. She kept her tone neutral. This was not the time for anger, though she had plenty. The human species has been engaged in continuous organized warfare for approximately 6,000 years of their recorded history. In that time, they have developed, tested, and deployed every category of weapon available to a pre-space civilization: kinetic, explosive, chemical, biological, nuclear, electromagnetic. They have fought wars on land, water, underground, in the air, and in orbital space. Every conflict has produced doctrinal and technological advancement. She paused. They did not develop their warships in response to our fleet. They developed their warships in response to each other. We were not the threat they were building for. She let the chamber sit with that. What that means, she said, is that our models assumed we would face a species that had built its military capability in response to known threats. Species that have fought only each other fight in ways calibrated to each other. The same hull strength, the same pain thresholds, the same willingness to absorb damage. When we deploy a pacification fleet, we are usually the highest capability force the target has ever encountered. The gap creates shock. The shock produces collapse. She looked at the display, at the human formation still sitting in tight cluster at the edge of the solar system. That gap does not exist here. Our fleet is not the most dangerous thing the human species has faced. They have been facing things as dangerous as our fleet, or more so, for 6,000 years. They have been training for this without knowing they were training for it. The chamber was very quiet now. Veth stood near the wall of the center floor. He was looking at the Mars facilities scan, the larger ships, the weapons emplacements that were not ambiguous. The 600 ships the Council has dispatched, Saris said, will outnumber the human fleet by more than 8 to 1. She looked at Veth, then at the moderator, then at the rings. I am asking this chamber to consider whether numerical superiority is the correct analysis, given what Fleet Commander Drack's engagement report tells us about how human vessels perform against superior numbers. Silence. Then the Tharnic representative spoke. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting, Saris said carefully, that before 800 of our ships engage 61 human vessels in the human home system, we understand what happened in the first 4 hours. Fully, not just the ship losses, the mechanics of it, why our suppression wave only disabled 7 ships, why a vessel that absorbed 11 direct hits continued to function and accelerate, why the human formation, after sustaining 30% losses, did not break. She looked at the chamber. Because if we do not understand that, and we send 800 ships, and the same mechanics apply at scale, then the mathematics become considerably worse for us. The room was quiet for a moment longer. Then a council elder, one of the oldest Kurai in the chamber, a figure who had been present for most of the last 3,000 years of council history, spoke from the upper ring. His voice was slow and considered. How thick, he said, are the hulls on those ships? Saris pulled up the specification analysis she had compiled. The hull thickness data from the sensor readings, cross-referenced with the mass and drive output to extrapolate structural density. The chamber looked at the numbers. The Tharnic representative said something quietly to his aide, and the aide looked at the numbers, and the aide said something back. And the representative leaned forward in his seat with an expression that had moved past concern into something more fundamental. What Saris had found, and what the chamber was now looking at, was this. The human ships were built with hull density that had no practical purpose for space travel. The added mass cost them speed, cost them fuel efficiency, created structural stresses in maneuver that required constant compensation. There was no engineering reason to build a ship that thick unless the assumption going into the design was that the ship would be hit. Repeatedly. By things designed to destroy ships exactly like it. They had been designed to fight themselves, which meant every structural assumption encoded into those hulls was calibrated against human weapons, which meant the suppression wave, designed for species whose electronic systems were less hardened and whose crews were less physiologically prepared for disorientation, had encountered hardened military electronics and crews that had been training in the disorienting conditions of high-intensity combat environments for their entire careers. 7 ships disabled out of 47. The other 40 had shaken it off and returned fire. Saris watched the chamber understand this. She watched it move through them, species by species, the recalibration happening in real time. Not panic. Not yet. But something shifting under the floor of the room. The solid certainty of 4,000 years of managed expansion developing a crack it hadn't had 3 hours ago. She stepped back from the center floor. Veth did not move to replace her. On Earth, the sensor data came through at 0400 hours station time, relayed from a deep space array that had been quietly repositioned during the 6-day window. Before first contact, General Osi was in the command center on Luna when the analyst brought it to her. The alien fleet was pulling back, not retreating. The formation was still there, still holding position outside the inner system. But the advance had stopped. The fleet had disengaged and gone still. Her officers read this as a victory. Several of them used that word. Osi let them use it. She understood why they needed to. She looked at the fleet size on the sensor readout. 178 effective vessels, estimate. More than 4 times what Earth had. They had pulled back anyway. She thought about why. Either they were damaged enough to need recovery time, or they were waiting for something, or both. Her instinct said both. Her instinct also said that if they were waiting, whatever they were waiting for was larger than what had already arrived. Get me the construction status on the 14 ships, she said. Her aide checked. 11 of the 14 were complete. Crews boarding now, 2 more within 12 hours. 1 had a drive fault that needed another day. 12 ships, Osei said. We have 12 more in the next 12 hours. Yes, General. She looked at the main display. Her fleet out there. 61 ships now, plus 12 more coming. The alien formation sitting still across the gap. She looked at the damage reports from the engagement. The Adamant had made it back. Torres had brought it in on emergency drive. Half its hull open to space, 2 of its weapon arrays completely gone. The crew had kept it together with emergency seals and controlled venting, and what Osi suspected was pure stubbornness. She had read the full engagement report from Torres. The part that stayed with her was near the end, a single line in the damage summary. Crew sustained 16 casualties, 42 injuries. Ship remains combat capable. Crew requests reassignment to front of formation. They wanted to go back to the front. The Adamant was half a wreck, and its crew wanted to go back to the front. Osei stood at the viewport in the command center and looked at the planet below. Earth turned in the dark, slow and blue and indifferent to the things being decided in its name. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't know. She knew the alien fleet had pulled back. She knew they had taken losses they hadn't expected. She knew the engagement report would go somewhere, back to whoever sent the fleet, back to whoever gave the order, and that somewhere, something would be decided. She didn't know what. She knew that whatever was decided, it would not be nothing. A civilization capable of sending 200 ships across the galaxy was not going to absorb 19 ship losses and a strategic retreat and decide to leave. They were going to send more. She didn't know how many more. She turned to her aide. Open a line to the Mars yards. I want to know what the maximum acceleration on new construction looks like if we strip every non-combat system from the build spec. Her aide looked uncertain. Strip build means no life support redundancy. No, I know what it means, Osi said. Find out. She turned back to the viewport. The planet turned below her, slow and blue. She watched it. 14 more ships from the yards in the next 72 hours if the strip build worked. After that, it depended on raw material throughput and drive unit production, which were both running at limits that the programs had never been tested at. She did the math in her head. The fleet was growing. She hoped it was growing fast enough. She hoped, but she was not the kind of person who relied on hope. So she kept moving and kept pushing and kept asking questions, because the alien fleet was sitting still out there across 40,000 kilometers of dark space. And sitting still meant waiting, and waiting meant something was coming. She was going to be ready for it. She was going to be ready for it, or she was going to have an answer for why she wasn't. Those were the only 2 options she was willing to consider. Below her, Earth turned. They came out of faster-than-light travel in a wall, not a formation, a wall. 800 ships dropping into real space across a front so wide that Earth's sensor arrays needed 40 seconds to finish counting them. They appeared all at once, the way a storm appears over flat land. First a darkness on the edge of the sky, then the full weight of it, total and immediate. Drax's remaining fleet folded into the larger formation without ceremony. His 178 ships disappeared into the mass of 800, like a handful of stones dropped into a lake. The combined fleet stretched across a volume of space that dwarfed anything that had ever assembled in the history of the solar system. It was meant to end the conversation before it started. On Luna, in the command center, the sensor alert woke every screen at once. Osi was already awake. She had not slept more than 3 hours in the last 4 days, and she was past the point where that registered as anything meaningful. She stood at the main display and watched the count climb. The analyst beside her said the number quietly when the arrays finished their sweep. 812 vessels. Confirmed. Osi looked at her own fleet count. 73 ships. The 12 from the stripped builds had come through. A 14th had launched 6 hours ago despite its drive fault. Torres had personally contacted the yard and told them to launch it and let her Crew fixed the drive on route, and the yard had done it because Torres was that kind of person. 73 against 812. Her officers were quiet. One of them, a young man named Reyes who had been one of the best tactical analysts in the program before the program, became real, looked at the display and then looked at Osi and said nothing. His face said it for him. Osi looked at the display for a long moment. Then she opened the fleet-wide communication channel. Every ship in the human formation received it simultaneously. She did not give a speech. She had never given speeches. She had watched other commanders give speeches before difficult engagements, and she had always thought the speeches were for the commanders more than the crews. The crews knew what was in front of them. The crews did not need words about honor or history or sacrifice. They needed to know one thing, that the person in command understood the situation completely and was not going to pretend otherwise, she said. They brought 800 ships. We have 73. They know where we live. They came here anyway. She paused for exactly 1 second. So did we, in a way. We've been fighting things our own size our whole lives. This is the same. Another pause. Hold the line. She closed the channel. Reyes looked at her. She could see him wanting to say something. She could see him deciding not to. Get the Adamant on the line, she said. I want Torres up front, on the council observation vessel. Saris watched the combined fleet from her small viewport, 800 ships. She had argued against this, not the number, the approach. She had argued that numbers were not the answer if the fundamental mechanics of the engagement were not yet understood. The council had not been interested in mechanics. They had been interested in resolution, and resolution meant force, and force meant numbers, and so here were the numbers. She watched the fleet begin its advance. It moved slowly at first, deliberately. The visual impact of 800 ships in forward motion was, she had to admit, extraordinary, even knowing what she knew, even believing what she believed. The sheer physical scale of it, the mass of those vessels moving through space in tight formation, was something that the mind processed as final, as inevitable, as a thing that did not get stopped. She looked at the long-range sensors, 73 human ships, sitting in their tight, dense cluster, same as before, same position, same stillness. She had expected them to run. She had expected, when the full fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel, that the human formation would scatter or retreat toward the inner planets, buying time, making the fleet chase them into territory that favored the defender. They didn't move. She thought about the message she had received. We know. She thought about General Ose, whose name she had found in the human communications files, whose face she had seen in a photograph taken by a monitoring probe at some facility on the fourth planet. A short, broad-shouldered woman standing in front of a ship in dry dock, looking at it with the expressions of someone who had been waiting a long time. Circe watched the fleet advance. She pressed her hand flat against the cold surface of the viewport. Osi watched the alien formation move on the main display, and she was thinking about numbers in a way that had nothing to do with the count. 800 ships, she had 73. In every conventional model of fleet engagement, that ratio produced one outcome. The side with 73 ships was destroyed, not depleted, not weakened, not driven back, destroyed. The firepower differential was absolute. She was not thinking conventionally. She had spent the 4 days since the first engagement reviewing every second of the sensor data. She had watched the playback of Drax's fleet, its formation, its response patterns, the way it had fired and maneuvered and coordinated. She had found 3 things. First, the alien fleet was designed for range. Its weapons were most effective at long distances, the kind of distances where the power output was available to overcome shielding and hull at full effect. At close range, the effectiveness dropped significantly, not to nothing, but significantly. Second, the fleet coordinated through a central command structure that was efficient and fast but hierarchical. When the flagship was disrupted in the first engagement, 2 sections of the fleet had lost coordination. The command structure was a strength in organized engagement and a weakness under targeted pressure. Third, the alien crews were experienced and disciplined and had every technological advantage. What they did not have, and what their doctrine did not appear to account for, was an opponent willing to close to contact range and stay there regardless of damage taken. Every species they had fought had tried to survive the engagement. The human ships were not primarily optimized for survival. They were optimized for impact. She had built her plan around these 3 things. And the plan was simple in the way that plans have to be simple when 73 ships face 800. There was no room for complexity. Complexity required margin. She had no margin. The plan was, get close, get inside their optimal range, hit the command structure, stay there. It was not a plan that guaranteed victory. It was a plan that guaranteed the engagement would not go the way the alien fleet expected. She had decided, a long time ago, that unexpected was enough. The alien fleet crossed the 40,000-kilometer mark, and she gave the order. 73 ships moved. What happened over the next 6 hours did not have a clean shape. Battles rarely do, but this one less than most, because what the human fleet was doing did not follow a pattern that the alien tactical systems were designed to track and counter. They split, not into organized subformations, but into groups of 4 and 5 ships that drove at different angles into the alien fleet line, each group picking a vector that forced the fleet to respond in multiple directions simultaneously. The alien fleet fired. It fired an enormous weight of weapons. Ships went dark and some went apart entirely, and the human formation, such as it was, absorbed losses that would have ended any conventional engagement 3 times over. The first hour, Earth lost 11 ships. The alien fleet lost 22. By the second hour, 47 human ships were in among the alien fleet. Not behind the line, not flanking it. Inside it. Close enough that the alien long-range weapons couldn't depress to target them without hitting their own vessels. The alien fleet was firing at human ships and hitting itself. The coordination that made 800 ships a single instrument was becoming the thing that made 800 ships a liability in close quarters. A group of 4 human ships found the command section in the third hour. Ozzy had identified it in the first engagement, not the flagship specifically. Drax had been replaced in the new fleet's command structure, but the pattern of communication signals that indicated where coordination was being managed. She had marked it. She had sent 4 ships toward it from the beginning of the engagement, taking a wide approach that kept them out of the main fighting until they reached the right position. They hit the command section from 3 angles. 2 of the 4 ships were destroyed getting there. The other 2 reached weapons range and opened up with everything they had, burning through their entire munitions load in under 8 minutes, targeting not just the command ship but the communication relay vessels flanking it. The command ship survived, damaged, but functional. But the relay vessels did not. The alien fleet lost to coordination for 11 minutes. 11 minutes is nothing in peacetime. In a close-quarters fleet engagement with 800 vessels, trying to track and respond to 73 that were moving in non-standard patterns and refusing to retreat and hitting things they had no business being close to. 11 minutes was everything. The alien fleet began to break formation, not from losses. The losses, though significant, were still manageable for 800 ships. It broke formation because the math stopped working, because the tactical systems that processed 800 ships worth of sensor data and generated response options were encountering a situation their models did not contain. Every time they generated a response, the human ships were not where the model said they would be, because the model assumed the human ships were trying to survive, and survival was not the primary variable being optimized. Ships at the rear of the alien formation began pulling back without orders, not retreating, pausing, recalibrating, creating space between themselves and the chaos at the front. The space grew. Saris watched it from the observation vessel, which had moved to the far edge of the engagement zone when the human ships started getting inside the fleet line. She watched on the sensor display as the rear sections of the fleet pulled further back. She watched the front sections, which were still fighting, still taking and giving damage, still technically holding. She watched a human ship, mid-sized, hull showing the same kind of deep damage she had seen on the Adamant before, fly through a gap between 2 alien cruisers, fire into both of them as it passed, come out the other side burning, and immediately turn back toward the fleet line for another pass. She pressed her hand against the viewport again. She understood it now. She had understood it intellectually for months, reading the files, looking at the numbers. But she understood it differently now, watching it. The human ships were not fighting to win. They were not fighting to survive. They were fighting to make the cost unbearable. Every ship that kept moving when it should have stopped. Every crew that turned back toward the line when they had a clear route to open space. It was not tactics. It was not even courage. Exactly. Courage implied a choice made against fear. And she was no longer sure the calculus these people were using had fear as a primary input. They had decided, somewhere, at some level below formal decision-making, that this was their place and these were their people. And the calculation was not, can we win? The calculation was, what will it cost them to take this from us? The answer they were generating with every passing hour was, more than it is worth. The alien fleet pulled back. It did not happen with an announcement or a signal or a formal withdrawal order. It happened the way retreats happen when they are not commanded but simply become the only remaining option. Ship by ship, section by section, the front line thinning as vessels dropped back, and the rear sections that had already been pulling away, continued pulling away. And the structure of 800 ships, became the structure of 800 ships trying to find distance from something they could not process. OC saw it on the display at hour 6. She did not celebrate. She watched it and she counted and she said to Reyes, "They're going." Reyes looked at the display. The alien formation was intact. They hadn't broken, hadn't scattered. They were retreating in order, which meant they were still a fleet and still a threat. But they were going. The gap between the formations was growing. He looked at her. "Do we pursue?" She thought about it for 2 seconds. "No," she said. "Hold position. Let them go." She turned away from the display. It took the Council 11 days to formally convene after the second engagement. 11 days because the report from the fleet commanders took time to compile, and because several delegation members requested the session be delayed until the full data was processed, and because there were conversations happening in private that needed time to resolve before they could become public positions. Sarah sat in her seat in the lower ring and waited. The losses were presented by a council administrator rather than Veth, who was present but had not spoken since the session opened. The alien fleet had lost 104 vessels in the second engagement. Earth had lost 31. The human fleet currently stood at 42 operational vessels, with 11 more under repair, and construction reports from the human facilities indicated the rate of new ship production had increased again. The chamber was very quiet. The council elder who had asked about hull thickness in the previous session raised his hand. He said, "I would like to hear from Junior Saris." Sierra stood. She had not prepared remarks this time. She didn't need them. She stood at the center floor and looked at the rings and said what she thought was true. "They will not stop," she said. "That is the only thing I know about this species with complete certainty. Everything else, their technology, their numbers, their capability, those things will grow and change and we can model them or fail to model them. But the stopping, that won't change." She looked at Veth. "They were fighting each other for 6,000 years and they never stopped. They have been fighting us for 11 days. They are building more ships while we are sitting in this chamber." She paused. "They do not have a threshold at which they stop. We assumed they did because every other species does. They don't." The chamber sat with this. "What do you recommend?" the elder asked. Saris had been thinking about this answer since before the vote, since the first time she read the files, since the first time she looked at the Mars shipyard photograph and counted the hulls in the dry dock cradles. "Remove them from the list," she said. "Remove them and never put them back. Create whatever classification this chamber needs to create. Call it whatever word exists in whatever language makes the meaning clear." She looked at the rings. "And do not go back there." The chamber was quiet for a long moment. The vote that followed was not close. OC found out 3 weeks later, through Saris's encrypted channel, still open, still routing through 3 relay points, when a short message arrived in mathematical notation. It said, "The order is rescinded. You are removed from all lists. New classification created. No translation exists in your language. Closest meaning, do not touch." OC read it once. She was standing at the viewport on the Lunar Command Center, looking at Earth turning below her. She had been standing there, on and off, for most of the past month. She found it useful. It kept things in proportion. She read the message again. Then she set the tablet down. Around her, the command center was running analysts at their stations, communication lines open, the constant low sound of a facility that had shifted from emergency mode to something that wasn't quite peacetime but wasn't active war either. Something in between, something new. She looked at the planet, 42 ships out there, the survivors, being repaired, resupplied, crewed by people who had done something that had no name yet in any human language either. She would need to find names for all of it eventually. The engagement, the campaign, whatever this was going to be called, by the people who wrote it down later. She would need to find words for what the crews had done, what the Adamant had done, what Torres had done. She didn't have those words yet. She looked at Earth. It turned slowly in the dark, the same as it always had, indifferent and enormous, the blue of it deep and unbroken from this distance. All of it down there, 9 billion people who had not known 6 weeks ago that the galaxy had voted on them, who had been going about their lives while a fleet crossed the dark toward their home, who had, some of them, watched the news and understood what was happening, and continued going about their lives anyway, because there was nothing else to do, and because that was what people did. She thought about what Saris had written. Closest meaning, do not touch. She thought about how 4,000 years of galactic civilization had looked at one species, looked at what it did and what it built and how it fought and what it refused to stop doing, and had decided that the appropriate response was distance. She didn't feel triumphant. She wasn't sure what she felt. She stood at the viewport for a long time. The planet turned. The Adamant was out there somewhere, repaired enough to fly. Torres probably standing at her own viewport, looking at the same planet from a different angle. The same thing visible from two different positions. Osi picked up the tablet and composed a message back through Saris's channel, short, mathematical notation. It said, "Received, thank you, again." She sent it. She stayed at the viewport. She watched Earth turn in the dark, slow and blue and still there, and said nothing. Because there was nothing that needed saying, and because some things are larger than words and the right response to them is simply to stand and look and understand that you are still standing. The planet turned. The stars were cold and still. And somewhere out past the edge of the solar system, in the dark between here and everything else, the galaxy gave a wide berth to a small blue world it had once decided to erase. It did not go back.